Hello, Comp 400 class. We are going to continue to look at sampling. And it's important to realize that sampling is representative of a population. And so if you had a large population, the sample would be a section of that. Now, a more technical definition that you're going to need to know is that population is a group or class of subjects, variables, concepts, or phenomenon. Basically, what that means is that you can sample all kinds of things. It's not just people, but you can sample you can sample houses, you can sample all kinds of things. One of the things that I use to illustrate this sometimes, or I describe it, but I'm going to show you right here. I consider sampling like maybe you have some stew, and sampling would be you'd reach inside and get some of that, and you'd taste it. Now, if it doesn't taste good, you realize probably the whole thing needs salt. So you put some salt in, stir it up, taste it. It tastes just right. So you've sampled it to determine whether the population has enough salt. And so you determine whether the population is salty. So another thing you should know is that the sample should represent the population. And in that case, that illustration, it does exactly represent that population. You're testing it to taste. One of the things, words you should know is a characteristic. A characteristic is a part of the what describes the sample. So a characteristic of a sample should also represent the population. Now, what a characteristic is something that you learn about the sample, and if you've done it right, then when you take that sample, it should tell you something about the population. Now, if you've ever eaten a batch of cookies, and I knew somebody who used to make cookies, and every once in a while you would bite into some baking soda and say, "Oh, this is awful." It didn't mean all the cookies were awful; it just meant that that was not a good sampling of those cookies. Another thing we talk about is a purposive sample, and I'll give you the specific wording I want you to know here. Subjects are selected on a specific characteristic. Now, what that means is that all the subjects have that characteristic. So maybe you're doing a study on smoking. So you would get all all of your subjects would have would perhaps be smokers. Another one would be if you're in advertising, you want to find out how people who use a refrigerator that you sell, what people think about it. So the characteristic, a purpose of sample would be getting those. Maybe you want to find out how college students have been affected by shelter in place. What you do there, you go and ask college students. So that's purposive. It's not random, it's not everybody, but it's purposely looking at a specific group. We also want to talk about sampling error. Sampling error is when the sample is different than the population, and that's what happens when you bite into that bicarbonate of soda, baking soda, and you find out, oh, this doesn't taste good. It's actually different than the rest. Maybe the rest tastes good. You just got one bad cookie. Sometimes somebody says, well, one bad apple doesn't mean that all of them are bad. It tends to spoil the rest, but maybe you just got a bad sample. So that's why it's important to do things that help you get a good sample. So that's sampling errors when the sample is different from the population. And when you get into statistics, you talk about quite a bit about that, but we're not going to talk about that now. There are two basic types of sample. Those are probability and non-probability. Now, probability samples are selected at random. We talked about how the randomness of gambling. So you really want to get that randomness in a sample. So the best kinds of samples are probability samples. If it's not probability, usually you're in big trouble. So the other kind of sample, quickly, is non-probability samples. Those are samples that don't follow the laws of probability. We still use them sometimes. Sometimes they're the best we have, but it's best to try to get probability samples. Let's look at two types, and we'll finish up this segment by looking at two types of non-probability samples. Okay, the first type of non-probability sample is the available sample. Now, that's often also called a convenience sample, and this uses the official title I have, or the official definition that I have is I use as readily available subjects. For instance, if you wanted to do a convenience sample, or group sample is a convenience sample, perhaps you go into the, plan to go into the quad, and you would go and whoever was in the quad, you would say, hey, could you take my survey? And they would run away screaming because they would say, we're supposed to shelter in place, stay 6 feet away from me. But at normal times, you might go to the quad and get that sample. So that would be convenient. It's good for you. It's not a random. Maybe you get certain kinds of people who are going to the quad, and so that's an example of a availability sample, also called a convenience sample. We also have a volunteer sample. A volunteer sample is where they say, who would like to be in this? We're going to give you maybe $20 to be part of this sample, and people will come. And so that's a volunteer. People volunteer to be part of it. Not random, however, because people may be motivated for a certain reason to be in that sample. And so there are problems with that. And specifically, often those who volunteer don't represent the larger population. By that, maybe you have something that says sports study. We are looking for people who will be part of this sports study, maybe $10 to be part of the sports study. And maybe some people would say, who are not interested in sports, would say, I don't want to do it for $10. Somebody who likes sports would say, I would do it for free, so definitely I'll be in that. So you might get a lot of people who are very interested in sports. People say, oh, this represents everybody. Volunteer samples tend to not be the best kind of sample. That's why they're called non-probability samples. And we'll talk more about samples in our next video.